Why was she the only one who never seemed surprised? The steam filled the tiled barracks showers, rising in slow curls against the fluorescent lights as 6 men shifted closer around her. Their laughter echoed against cold walls, a chorus of arrogance and cruelty. They blocked every exit. They thought she would panic, that she would beg, that she would reveal what they already whispered about her, that she didn't belong here, that the Air Force had lowered its standards for one more diversity recruit. Instead, she exhaled once, a slow, controlled breath. Her face did not flinch. Her eyes studied the ringleader's smirk, the way his stance carried more show than substance. The calm was unnerving, and though none of them admitted it in that moment, something shifted in the air. When it ended, the steam carried a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. 6 elite soldiers lay incapacitated on cold tiles, groaning in disbelief. The woman they tried to humiliate had revealed herself in 30 brutal seconds, not through anger, not through pride, but through precision. And though the consequences would ripple through Fort Braxton for months, no one could yet know what that silence truly meant. But to understand why, you have to go back. Back to the first morning she stepped into the cold air of the base and walked toward the obstacle course. Dawn cracked over the training grounds, thin mist clinging to the dirt and rope bridges, barbed wire glistening with dew. The air carried a crisp bite, every breath forming small clouds that drifted and broke apart. Recruits shuffled in formation, some joking, some stretching with exaggerated confidence. Most were still boys in their movements, eager to be seen. Ellsworth Voring was not. She walked to the starting line with a focus that unsettled even the hardened drill sergeants. Every step was deliberate. Her movements were efficient, stripped of excess, as though each ounce of energy was rationed for survival. She was shorter than most, shoulders narrower, her dark hair tied back tight enough to leave nothing loose. Sergeant Kessler checked his stopwatch. His face was carved by years of discipline, but his eyes narrowed the moment she stepped forward. "Voring," he barked, "you're up." The recruits behind her snickered. "Let's see if she can even clear the wall." Ellsworth crouched slightly, breath steady. Then the whistle blew. What followed silenced every mutter. She moved like water vaulting over walls, sliding beneath barbed wire, arms and legs finding natural rhythm across rope bridges. She didn't grunt. She didn't waste sound. Where others fought the course, she adapted to it, body flowing in harmony with obstacles that seemed designed to break her. By the time she crossed the finish line, her boots hit dirt with quiet finality. The stopwatch showed a record. Kessler looked at the numbers, his face unreadable. He didn't praise. He didn't smile. He muttered only, "Acceptable, Voring," before shifting his gaze to the next recruit. "Jenkins, show us how it's really done." The broad-shouldered Jenkins heaved himself across the course, slower, louder, visibly struggling where Ellsworth had been fluid. When he finished, the clock revealed he was nearly a full minute slower. Kessler clapped him on the shoulder. "That's how a soldier does it. Outstanding work." No one missed the double standard, but Ellsworth's face didn't change. She returned to formation, posture perfect, eyes forward. Later in the mess hall, whispers spread like wildfire. At a crowded table, Corporal Daxton Marrero held court. His squad leaned in, men who had shared deployments, drinking stories, scars they wore like medals. When Ellsworth entered alone, trays in hand, the table's laughter softened into a different rhythm, pointed whispers, sidelong glances. "Another experiment," Marrero muttered just loud enough for nearby tables. "Standards keep dropping. In real combat, that gets people killed." The men nodded, chewing slowly, watching her as she sat at the far end, alone. She opened a tactical manual, flipping pages while she ate in silence. Her posture didn't flinch, but every sideways glance pressed against her like a test of will. "She acts like she's better than us," one of Marrero's men hissed. "Then someone should remind her she's not," Marrero replied, his eyes narrowing. It was the beginning of a pattern. Her locker combination changed overnight. Training schedules omitted her name. Equipment signed out under her ID vanished minutes before inspections. A boot missing before morning formation. A compass failing during a night navigation test. Each time she adapted. When her boots disappeared, she arrived in older ones polished to perfection. When her navigation equipment failed, she traced the stars overhead and arrived first at the checkpoint. When her gear was misplaced, she improvised from memory. She never complained. She never raised her voice, and that silence infuriated them more than anything. But silence carried weight. One evening, while most recruits gathered in the lounge, Ellsworth sat on her bunk, posture upright, pen racing across the pages of a leather-bound journal. The handwriting was shorthand, quick, efficient, unreadable. She heard footsteps approaching and, without pause, slipped the journal beneath her pillow. Sergeant Calloway stopped at her bunk, arms folded. Unlike others, his tone was not mocking. "Studying again, Voring. The test isn't until next week." "I prefer to be prepared, Sergeant." He studied her, curiosity flickering. Previous military experience, right. File mentioned some deployment time. Something shifted in her eyes, not fear, more like calculation. "Sometime overseas, yes, nothing remarkable." "Where?" Calloway pressed. "Various locations." She closed the manual calmly. "If you'll excuse me, Sergeant, I need to prepare for tomorrow's drills." As he walked away, a flicker of memory rose unbidden in her mind. A dusty street, a frightened child speaking Farsi, gunfire in the distance. Her own hand steady, her voice fluent, calm in chaos. The memory submerged as quickly as it surfaced, buried beneath the mask she wore each day. But even masks leave shadows. The next morning, training shifted to squad-based urban combat simulations. By administrative error, Ellsworth was reassigned, not with her original team, but with Marrow's. His grin as she joined them left little doubt it was no accident. "Try to keep up, Voring," he smirked. The simulation began. Squads moved through a mock village, securing routes, exchanging fire with opposition forces. Ellsworth's squad deliberately left her exposed, feeding her false intelligence. Within minutes, they were pinned down, surrounded, extraction routes cut off. And then something happened that none of them expected. Ellsworth emerged from shadow, rifle at the ready, eyes sharp. She shifted their positions, set covering fire, created an escape route with the clarity of someone who had lived these moments before. Her commands were precise, unshaken, carrying the tone of authority without needing to demand it. Marrow scowled but obeyed, because survival left no choice. Under her direction, the squad not only escaped but secured one of the highest scores of the exercise. From an observation tower, Colonel Hargrove watched, eyes narrowing. He did not applaud. He did not move. But his attention never left her. Later in his office, he pulled her file, thin, unremarkable, almost suspiciously so. His fingers tapped the folder once before he made a secure, 30-second phone call. That night, Lieutenant Webb intercepted Ellsworth outside the facility. His voice dripped with polite contempt. "Quite a performance today, Voring, but showing up your team doesn't build cohesion." I responded to tactical necessity, sir. "Advice," he leaned closer, voice lowering. "This isn't an environment that rewards standing out, especially for someone in your position. Adjust your approach if you want to finish this program." Her eyes met his steady, "Understood, sir." But when she turned away, her gaze flicked briefly toward the security camera above the doorway. The faintest trace of calculation returned. And later that night, in a secluded corner, she lifted a phone not issued by the base. Her voice was low, precise, almost devoid of emotion. "Position established, evidence gathering proceeding, key subjects identified, phase 2 to follow." Then silence. She ended the call, slipped the device back into her locker, and sat on the edge of her bunk. Around her, recruits laughed, argued, lived in the naive noise of youth. She sat still, silent, waiting. Because there was something none of them had realized yet. This wasn't training for her, this was something else. How much pressure can one person take before they finally break? The morning after her flawless performance in the simulation, Ellsworth arrived for formation with the same perfect posture, boots aligned in the dirt, eyes forward. To anyone watching, she was unshaken, untouched by the tension around her. But beneath the surface, the storm was brewing, and every recruit around her could feel it. They didn't whisper anymore. They muttered openly now, voices dripping with sarcasm whenever her name was called. She didn't rise to it. She didn't need to. Her silence was more unbearable than confrontation. But silence has a cost. When she returned to her locker that evening, the door hung open, the contents scattered across the floor. Her uniform shirt had been slashed, cut through as if by a blade. Across the steel door, a note had been taped. Accidents happen during live fire. She stood there for a moment, staring at it, her face perfectly still. Then, without a word, she removed the note, folded it, and slid it into a small waterproof pouch she carried at all times. One by one, she replaced the items in her locker, folding each piece of clothing with careful precision, as though restoring order was its own defiance. Later, she reported it to Lieutenant Webb. His office smelled faintly of old coffee and dust, blinds half drawn against the harsh sun. She placed the note on his desk, posture rigid, her words crisp. Harassment threat, reporting per protocol. Webb glanced at the paper, then at her. His smirk was subtle, the kind men wear when they believe they hold all the power. Military life isn't for everyone, Voring. These look like pranks, typical barracks banter, toughen up, or perhaps consider another career path. Her eyes locked with his for a brief second, sharp enough that he actually faltered before hiding it behind a cough. "As you say, sir," she replied evenly. Then she turned, walking out without waiting to be dismissed. What Webb didn't notice was the small device she had affixed beneath his desk as she leaned forward moments earlier, nor the way her gaze had briefly catalogued the training rotation schedule displayed on his computer screen. Every piece mattered, every insult, every sabotage, every careless word. She collected them not out of wounded pride but out of strategy. That night, while the barracks filled with the noise of card games and crude jokes, Ellsworth sat alone again, her journal open. Her pen moved in rapid shorthand, diagrams and times etched into the pages. She paused only once, hearing footsteps. Private Hoskins lingered nearby, his eyes flicking toward her bunk. She slid the journal under her pillow. Hoskins flushed, muttering an excuse as he walked away. He was younger than the others, less certain, his gaze sometimes holding questions instead of cruelty. Ellsworth watched him leave, her face giving nothing away. But in the shadows of her thoughts, she marked him as something important, a witness, perhaps even a variable that could turn. The next day, the tension sharpened. During the shooting range exercise, she raised her rifle, lining up the target, only to realize half her rounds were duds, primers removed, useless. Sabotage that could have killed her if it had been live fire. She said nothing. She calmly cleared the weapon, photographed the evidence with a hidden device in her boot, and finished the drill without complaint. At chow that evening, Marrero leaned across the table toward his men. His voice was loud enough to carry. "Some soldiers never make it back from training grounds. Accidents happen, right?" Laughter followed. Ellsworth heard it. She did not react. She finished her meal, wiped her tray clean, and walked away. But that night, alone in a secluded hallway, she lifted the secure phone again. Her words were soft, precise, stripped of emotion. Escalation continuing as expected. Primary subjects behaving consistent with previous patterns. Evidence at 70% threshold. Requesting authorization for culmination phase within 48 hours. The voice on the other end was faint, almost mechanical. Authorization granted. Extraction team on standby. She closed the phone, sliding it back into concealment, her breath slow. For a moment she sat there in silence, the weight of two worlds pressing against her, the role she played and the role she truly carried. Morning came with an edge of cruelty. The day's exercise, a forced 12-mile march in full gear, followed immediately by combat drills. Muscles ached, sweat streaked every face, men groaned under the weight of packs. Ellsworth's pace never faltered. She did not sprint, she did not drag. She moved with the steady rhythm of inevitability. Marrow's men circled her, their mutters barely hidden. Shame about the showers tonight. Only one facility open after 2000. No privacy. The laughter that followed was not the kind that comes from amusement. It was a warning. Ellsworth didn't flinch. At the next water break, she crouched near a fountain, adjusting her boot lace, and carefully slid a small button-sized device beneath the fountain bench where Webb often sat. Every action, every plant, was quiet preparation. By 2100 hours that evening, exhausted recruits stumbled toward bunks. But Ellsworth carried her towel and supplies, walking with deliberate calm toward the showers. Her pace gave nothing away. But her mind was counting steps, doors, cameras, angles. The women's facility sat in an older wing of the barracks, its security camera coverage conveniently limited. A design flaw, or perhaps a design choice. Reports about it had been filed before. They had gone ignored. She stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of soap and damp tile. Steam lingered from earlier use. She placed her things neatly on a bench, aligning them precisely as though this moment were nothing more than routine. She turned on a shower, letting the water run, her back to the door. She adjusted the knobs with hands that did not shake. Then the door clicked, locked. Footsteps heavy, more than one. "Well, look who's all alone." Marrow's voice, mocking, dangerous. She turned slowly, her face calm, her towel still folded. Behind him stood 5 men. Hoskins lingered at the back, shifting, uncomfortable, his eyes betraying a flicker of doubt. "You should leave," Ellsworth said simply, her tone even almost soft. Marrow smirked, stepping closer. "We're just having a conversation about belonging. Some of us earned our place here through generations. Others got pushed through by quotas." The words hung in the steam. Ellsworth's stance shifted barely an inch. Her weight redistributed, her center lowered. A change so small most wouldn't notice, but the air changed with it. Marrow moved first. His hand shot forward for her arm, arrogance in every motion. And that was when the calm shattered. What followed was speed, precision, efficiency, not rage, not desperation. Just practiced, honed violence condensed into movements so fast that later, when the footage was reviewed, officers would demand frame-by-frame analysis to even understand. 30 seconds later, 5 men were on the ground. Broken, gasping, incapacitated. Hoskins stood frozen, wide-eyed against the wall. Ellsworth stood in the center, her breathing barely elevated, her expression unreadable. "Are you participating in this assault, Private?" she asked Hoskins calmly. Before he could answer, the door burst open. Colonel Hargrove stepped inside, flanked by military police. His eyes swept the scene, 5 incapacitated soldiers, 1 trembling witness, and Ellsworth standing steady in the steam. He nodded once. "I believe we have what we need." And for the first time since she had arrived at Fort Braxton, he addressed her properly. "Captain Voreen." Hoskins froze, the title striking like thunder. The men groaning on the tiles understood nothing. But Hoskins suddenly realized. The truth had never been about her belonging. She was never here to belong. She was here for something else. Something bigger. What happens when the mask comes off? The steam had barely cleared when the military police moved in. Heavy boots striking tile. Zip ties pulled tight. Groans of half-conscious men echoing under fluorescent light. For weeks they had whispered, laughed, plotted. Now they lay on the cold floor of the very room where they thought they would prove dominance. And she stood among them, calm, silent, breathing measured, posture unbroken. Colonel Hargrove's voice cut through the haze. "Secure them. Protocol watchdog is now active." The words carried weight. They were not improvised, they were planned. Hoskins remained frozen against the wall, eyes wide, chest heaving. His mind tried to reconcile the image of Ellsworth Voreen, the quiet, isolated recruit he had seen mocked day after day, with the woman who had just dismantled 5 trained soldiers in under half a minute. And then came the blow that shattered every illusion. "Captain Voreen," Hargrove said formally, his voice echoing against tile, "your cover is complete." The title struck like a gunshot. Hoskins' breath caught. He turned his head toward her slowly, disbelief painted across his young face. "Captain, not airman, not recruit. Captain." Ellsworth didn't react. She didn't nod, didn't smirk, didn't seek validation. She simply stood at parade rest, posture perfect, her silence heavier than words. The MPs dragged the incapacitated men out, one by one, their groans muffled by the sound of camera shutters. Technicians moved in, documenting the scene with clinical precision. One of them retrieved the small button-sized device from under the bench, the hidden camera Ellsworth had placed days earlier. It had captured everything. Later in Colonel Hargrove's office, the footage played on loop across 3 monitors, every angle, every detail. Ellsworth's movements dissected, frozen, replayed. What the men had seen as humiliation had been exposed as something else entirely, an operation. Hargrove leaned back in his chair, hands folded, his weathered face unreadable. Across from him, Ellsworth, now properly addressed as captain, stood at attention, her bearing transformed. The deliberately subdued recruit was gone. In her place stood the decorated officer who had survived wars most of them would never read about. 3 months, Hargrove muttered, scrolling through her file on a secure terminal. 3 months of deep cover. That makes this your 3rd, correct? Beringer, McConnell, and now Braxton. "Yes, sir," Ellsworth replied evenly. Her voice no longer carried the rehearsed neutrality of a recruit. It carried the calm precision of authority. Hargrove's eyes flicked to the screen, watching again as she neutralized Marrero with surgical efficiency. "Those techniques aren't standard training." "Joint Special Operations Command," she confirmed, "with CIA operational liaison. Cover designed to appear unremarkable, performance deliberately restrained until escalation reached critical threshold." "Which we just witnessed." "Yes, sir." Hargrove exhaled, rubbing his temples. "The Pentagon takes this seriously, particularly now. Congress has been circling retention numbers, especially among women and minorities. This," he gestured toward the footage, "will hit them like a hammer." At that moment, military police escorted Lieutenant Webb past the office window. His uniform was wrinkled, his face pale, but his jaw was set in defiance. Hargrove didn't look at him. Webb was central, wasn't he? Ellsworth's eyes shifted briefly, her expression steady. "Yes, he facilitated harassment networks, suppressed formal complaints. Victims were discredited, forced out through manipulated reviews, or pressured into silence with career threats. And Marrero. Execution arm, direct intimidation, enforcement." Hargrove drummed his fingers on the desk. He had been in command long enough to know how shadows operated beneath the surface, but even for him, the scale was staggering. He closed the file, locking the system with a thumbprint scan. "Langley sent their best," he said finally. Ellsworth didn't respond. She didn't need to. The next morning, Fort Braxton woke to whispers that spread faster than smoke in dry brush. Soldiers passed each other in corridors with lowered voices. Something had happened in the showers. MPs were moving everywhere. Officers summoned at odd hours. And most unsettling of all, Ellsworth Voreen, the recruit everyone mocked, now walked the base with a quiet authority that made people stare. By mid-morning, the truth was undeniable. Formation was called in the central auditorium. Rows of soldiers sat rigid, anticipation in the air. Colonel Hargrove stood at the podium, flanked by armed MPs. His expression was grave. "Effective immediately," he announced. "Fort Braxton is under administrative review by direct order of the Secretary of Defense." The words dropped like lead. Murmurs rippled through the hall. MPs at the doors silenced them with their presence. Hargrove continued, his voice steady. "Lieutenant Webb and several non-commissioned officers have been detained pending investigation into serious violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. This includes harassment, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to suppress formal complaints." Gasped Whisper's shock. And Hargrove said, stepping aside, "I wish to formally recognize Captain Ellsworth Voring." She stepped forward, wearing her proper uniform for the first time on Braxton soil. Captain's bars gleamed on her shoulders. A row of combat decorations caught the light. The silence in the room thickened as dozens of eyes widened in disbelief. Some remembered laughing at her in the mess hall. Others recalled rolling their eyes when she spoke in clipped answers. Now they stared at the truth that they had been mocking a decorated officer, a woman who had bled in wars they would never understand. "She was sent here under deep cover," Hargrove explained, "as part of Operation Watchdog. Her mission: to investigate systemic harassment, leadership complicity, and suppression of complaints. Fort Braxton, like Beringer and McConnell before it, showed patterns that could not be ignored, and now those patterns have been exposed." For a moment, silence. Then a low ripple of voices, recruits exchanging glances heavy with realization. At the front row, Sergeant Calloway's jaw tightened. She had suspected. She had seen the composure, the strange calm, the flashes of something more. Now the pieces fit. Ellsworth stood at attention. She did not scan the crowd. She did not seek recognition. Her eyes were forward, her posture perfect, her silence absolute. In the back, a young female recruit whispered to the soldier beside her, "Is it true?" She took down 6 men by herself. The soldier swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on Ellsworth. "It's true." That night in a secured facility, Lieutenant Webb sat under bright lights. Across from him, investigators laid out evidence, recordings, surveillance footage, documented incidents. He leaned back, his arrogance evaporating as the truth became undeniable. "You're facing multiple violations," the lead investigator said flatly. "Articles 93 and 133, conduct unbecoming, suppression of complaints, harassment networks, 7 resignations tied to your command in 18 months. Webb's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. He knew the evidence was comprehensive. In another room, Marrero watched footage of the shower confrontation. His face drained of color as he saw himself dismantled in seconds. "Who is she?" he whispered, horror dawning. The investigator flipped a file open. "Captain Ellsworth Voring, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, operations in 7 countries, former instructor at Fort Bragg's Advanced Close Quarters Combat School, currently assigned to JSOC with CIA liaison." Marrero slumped, realization crushing him. "We thought she was just another diversity placement." "That prejudice," the investigator said coldly, "was exactly what Operation Watchdog was designed to expose." And across the base, in a quieter room, Private Hoskins sat trembling across from Ellsworth. His hands shook, his voice cracked. "I didn't stop them," he whispered. "I didn't participate, but I didn't stop them." Ellsworth studied him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes carried a weight that made him squirm. "Why?" she asked softly. Hoskins stared at the floor. "Fear, wanting to belong. They controlled everything: passes, assignments, reputation. After a while, it just felt normal." Ellsworth slid several photographs across the table, women in uniform, their names and ranks clear. These service members left after similar experiences. Their complaints disappeared. Their careers ended before they began. Hoskins swallowed hard, staring at the faces. I never knew their names. That was deliberate, Ellsworth said. Dehumanization makes harassment possible. Names create accountability. She leaned forward, her voice steady. You have a choice now, Private. Stay silent or testify. One continues the cycle, the other breaks it. Hoskins looked up at her. His eyes glistened. His lips trembled. For the first time since his arrival at Fort Braxton, he felt the crushing weight of what silence costs. Outside, the base hummed with transformation. Offices sealed. Computers locked for forensic scans. Files retrieved from archives long buried. What had been whispers in showers and corridors was now an official investigation with no escape. And at the center of it all, Ellsworth Voring walked in silence, calm, steady, unflinching. Because this had never been about her belonging. It had always been about something larger. Justice. What happens when silence is finally broken? Morning light streaked through the blinds of Colonel Hargrove's office. He sat hunched at his desk, watching the same footage for what felt like the 100th time. On screen, the shower confrontation played again. Steam, shadows, the sudden burst of violence distilled into 30 seconds of mechanical efficiency. He paused the frame on Ellsworth's final stance, her posture calm, unshaken, as 6 men lay scattered across the tile. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. He had commanded men through war, had watched mortars light the sky and comrades carried off in stretchers. But this felt different. This was not the battlefield. This was inside the walls of his own command, and it had been happening under his watch. A knock broke the silence. The door opened, and a silver-haired woman in civilian attire stepped inside. Her presence shifted the air instantly. Colonel Hargrove stood at attention before she even spoke. "General Blackwood," he said, startled. "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." Brigadier General Amara Blackwood removed her sunglasses, her eyes sharp as steel. She glanced at the paused footage on his screen. "The Joint Chiefs requested immediate briefing," she said evenly. "This makes 3 confirmed bases: Braxton, Beringer, McConnell. The Secretary is personally involved now." Hargrove swallowed, his throat dry. The presence of a Pentagon general in his office was never a good omen, but her tone left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger. In the adjacent conference room, Ellsworth sat reviewing documents on a secure tablet. The mask of a recruit was long gone. Now she sat with the posture of a decorated officer, her bearing transformed, her presence undeniable. She did not glance up when the door opened, but when General Blackwood and Hargrove entered, she rose smoothly to attention. "At ease, Captain," Blackwood said, her voice carrying both authority and respect. She allowed a faint smile. "3 for 3. Your infiltration continues to exceed expectations." "Thank you, General," Ellsworth replied. Her tone was even, almost detached. This was not pride, it was focus. Blackwood sat at the table, scanning the files. "Your preliminary findings." "Organized harassment network," Ellsworth said, sliding the tablet toward her. "Mid-level leadership complicity. Lieutenant Webb coordinated suppression of complaints. Corporal Marrero executed intimidation in the field. Patterns match Beringer and McConnell. Victims discredited. Careers ended prematurely. 7 confirmed exits in the last 18 months alone." Blackwood's jaw tightened. She glanced at Hargrove. "You were briefed on Operation Watchdog 3 months ago, Colonel. Did you suspect the scope was this severe?" Hargrove shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face revealing the weight of guilt. "I suspected tension, cliques, the usual frictions. I had no idea it was this systemic." "That," Blackwood said sharply, "is precisely the problem. These networks thrive in blind spots. Plausible deniability becomes their shield, until someone like Captain Voring tears the veil away." The door opened again. 2 military attorneys entered, accompanied by personnel from the Inspector General's office. The table grew crowded. The scale of response was clear. This wasn't going to be buried. Across the base, the transformation had already begun. MPs secured offices. Forensic technicians copied hard drives, pulling files that Webb had tried and failed to delete. In interrogation rooms, Webb sat pale and silent as charges were read aloud. Conspiracy, harassment, suppression, conduct unbecoming. The weight of Articles 93 and 133 pressed against him like chains. In another room, Marrero shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone. A monitor replayed the footage of his squad collapsing under Ellsworth's precision strikes. His jaw clenched as the truth sank in. He had thought she was prey. He had never realized she was the hunter. "Who is she?" he whispered, eyes locked on the screen. The investigator flipped a heavily redacted file. Captain Ellsworth Voring, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, combat deployments in 7 countries, former instructor at Fort Bragg Close Quarters School, JSOC assignment with CIA liaison. Marrero's shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had defined him drained away, replaced by something colder: regret. In a smaller room, Private Hoskins sat trembling across from Ellsworth. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands shaking as he tried to meet her gaze. "I didn't stop it," he said, voice breaking. "I knew what they were doing. I didn't stop them." Ellsworth regarded him with steady eyes. Her silence forced him to keep speaking. "At first it was fear, wanting to belong. They controlled everything. Then it became normal." Ellsworth slid photographs across the table, faces of women in uniform, names, ranks, soldiers who had left, soldiers whose complaints had vanished. "These are the ones who came before you," she said softly. "They left not because they weren't strong enough, but because the system was designed to break them." Hoskins stared at the photographs, his breath hitched. "I never knew their names." "That was deliberate," she replied. "Dehumanization makes harassment possible. Names create accountability." She leaned closer, her tone quiet but unyielding. "You have a choice now. Stay silent and continue the cycle, or testify and break it." Tears welled in Hoskins' eyes. He nodded slowly. "I'll testify." Ellsworth didn't smile. She simply leaned back, her expression unreadable. Silence again, heavier than praise. By midday, Fort Braxton had become a hive of activity. Files stacked in conference rooms, attorneys drafting statements, investigators combing through years of overlooked complaints. Every corridor buzzed with the awareness that nothing would ever be the same. Colonel Hargrove stood before assembled personnel in the central auditorium, flanked by MPs and investigators. His voice carried through the hall, grave and unflinching. "Effective immediately, Fort Braxton is under external review. Lieutenant Webb, Corporal Marrero, and multiple non-commissioned officers are in custody. This investigation will be thorough, it will be transparent, and it will hold accountable those who failed in their duty." He paused, scanning the sea of faces. "I also wish to acknowledge Captain Ellsworth Voring. Her undercover operation exposed failures that were invisible to us but devastating to those who lived them. Because of her work, change begins now." Ellsworth stepped forward. For the first time the base saw her in full dress uniform, medals glinting, captain's bars shining, a soldier whose record was carved from sacrifice and resilience. The room was silent, awed, unsettled. Some stared with guilt, remembering the whispers and jokes. Others, especially the women, looked at her with something deeper: hope. One young recruit whispered, "Is it true she fought 6 men alone?" Another answered softly, "Yes, but maybe the fight was never just about that." Later that night, in the privacy of her quarters, Ellsworth sat by a small desk. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a pause. Her fingers brushed the edge of her journal, pages filled with shorthand, times, names, evidence collected like fragments of war. She stared at the page, her breathing slow. She wasn't proud, she wasn't relieved, she was simply steady. Because for her, this was never about proving herself. It was about exposing what others refused to see. And as the lights across Fort Braxton burned late into the night, and General Blackwood's team built their case, Ellsworth knew the truth in her bones. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought overseas. Sometimes they are fought in silence, in hallways, in showers filled with steam and cruelty. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. What happens when truth can no longer be ignored? 6 months earlier, Ellsworth Voring had walked onto Fort Braxton with nothing more than a recruit's uniform, a quiet demeanor, and a cover story deliberately designed to be forgettable. Now, half a year later, the base buzzed with something entirely different. Investigators combing files, attorneys drafting cases, and senior officers arriving from Washington in unmarked cars. Her mission had detonated like a controlled charge. The walls that had hidden harassment and silence for years were crumbling, and everyone felt it. The tribunal room was stark, its walls lined with flags and emblems. Lieutenant Webb sat at a table, hands cuffed, jaw tight. Across from him, investigators read charges with the calm of inevitability. Conspiracy, suppression of formal complaints, harassment, conduct unbecoming an officer, multiple violations under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Each word landed like a nail hammered into wood. Webb's expression, once smug, was now brittle. He leaned back, staring at the table, his silence more revealing than any argument he could make. In another chamber, Corporal Marrero watched the footage again. The screen froze on the moment Ellsworth's hand deflected his strike, her counter so precise it looked choreographed. His eyes burned with disbelief. "She wasn't supposed to be," he muttered. His voice broke off. The investigator across the table cut him short. "She was never what you thought, that's the point." He slid a file forward. Captain Ellsworth Voring, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, instructor at Fort Bragg, operations in 7 countries. Marrero's mouth opened, then closed. He slumped back in his chair. "We thought she was weak." "That prejudice," the investigator said evenly, "was exactly what Operation Watchdog was designed to reveal." Meanwhile, in a quieter room, Private Hoskins sat hunched over, trembling as he spoke into a recorder. His words spilled out in halting rhythm. "I saw the notes, the threats. I heard Marrero's men talk about the showers. I knew what they were planning, and I stayed quiet. I was afraid." His hands shook as he signed the testimony. When he looked up, Ellsworth was there. She said nothing. She simply gave the faintest nod, and somehow, for Hoskins, that silence meant more than any speech. But the real storm was still ahead. In Washington, word of Fort Braxton spread fast. Congressional offices called for immediate briefings. The Secretary of Defense demanded files within days, not weeks. News outlets whispered of systemic failures. For every soldier who had been silenced, the story now had a voice amplified by the weight of national scrutiny. General Blackwood stood before a panel of senators, her tone sharp, her words deliberate. "Operation Watchdog has confirmed systemic harassment and suppression across 3 major installations. Evidence includes 300 hours of surveillance, 47 documented incidents, and testimony from multiple former service members whose complaints were buried." One senator leaned forward. "General, are you suggesting these failures were deliberate?" Blackwood didn't flinch. "I'm stating it outright. Mid-level leadership coordinated to discredit and expel qualified personnel who did not fit their cultural template of a soldier. That is a betrayal of readiness, a betrayal of duty, and a betrayal of the oath we all swore." Her words rippled across the chamber. Headlines would carry them by nightfall. Back at Fort Braxton, Ellsworth avoided the noise. She never sought cameras, never lingered in press conferences. Her work was not in speeches. It was in silence, in the methodical collection of names, times, patterns. Each detail was a brick in the wall of evidence. Late one night, she sat alone in a dimly lit office, reviewing testimony on a secure terminal. The photographs of women who had left haunted the screen. Some stared defiantly at the camera, others carried quiet sorrow in their eyes. One had scrawled a note in her exit file. No one ever listened. Ellsworth's hand hovered over the image. Her jaw tightened, but her eyes stayed dry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. Action did. Outside, the base was changing. Barracks where harassment once thrived were now subject to new oversight. The showers, once a place of whispered threats, now carried new locks, cameras, and patrols. The very architecture of the base was being rewritten, not for efficiency but for accountability. But cultural rot is harder to cut out than faulty wiring. Some soldiers muttered that the system was going soft. Others whispered that Captain Voring had set them back. They never said it to her face, not anymore, but the undercurrent was there. And she felt it. One evening, she walked the perimeter in silence, the chill air biting her skin. Her boots crunched gravel as the sun dipped behind the training fields. For the first time in months, she let herself wonder if the change would last. Would new locks and oversight survive the next budget cut? Would policy shifts hold when memories faded and politics shifted? She thought of Kandahar, a dusty street, a little girl clutching her hand, promises whispered under fire. She had seen how fragile systems could be, how quickly protection could crumble when vigilance waned. Her mission at Braxton had ended, but the war, the real war, was not over. The next morning, General Blackwood summoned her. The room was smaller than expected, its blinds drawn, its table cluttered with secure files. Blackwood slid a sealed folder across to her. The Secretary has authorized immediate implementation of Protocol Renaissance. Your findings will shape new oversight across all branches. And, she hesitated, a flicker of something human breaking her usual steel. The FBI has requested your expertise. Similar patterns are surfacing in law enforcement. They want your methods adapted. Ellsworth accepted the file silently. She did not look surprised. Systemic problems require systemic solutions, she said simply. Blackwood studied her. You've carried this alone for months. Are you sure you're ready to carry more? Ellsworth's eyes lifted, steady and calm. This was never about me being ready, General. It was about whether the system was. Outside, spring sunlight stretched across the parade ground. Recruits marched in cadence, their boots striking rhythm into the earth. Somewhere in the line, young women moved with shoulders squared, their presence no longer hidden in shadows or silenced in showers. And for the first time, Ellsworth allowed herself a small, fleeting thought. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something larger than even she had imagined. Because sometimes change doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes it comes disguised as silence, until silence becomes impossible to ignore. What does justice look like when it finally arrives? The tribunal chamber was colder than expected, not in temperature but in atmosphere. Every chair filled, every uniform crisp, every face stiff with the awareness that this was no ordinary proceeding. Lieutenant Webb sat at the defendant's table, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched. Once he had walked Fort Braxton with casual arrogance, dismissing complaints with smirks and thinly veiled threats. Now he sat handcuffed, stripped of authority, awaiting judgment. The charges were read in the calm, unyielding rhythm of military law. Conspiracy, harassment, suppression of formal complaints, evidence tampering, conduct unbecoming an officer. Each word carried the weight of Article 93 and 133, carved into the code he had once wielded against others. Now it turned against him. Across the chamber, Ellsworth sat silently in her dress uniform. She did not watch him with anger. She did not look triumphant. She simply observed, her face unreadable, her posture exact. Webb glanced at her once. For the first time, his eyes betrayed something unfamiliar: fear. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Dishonorable discharge, criminal conviction, maximum sentence under the Uniform Code. His career, once protected by silence, ended in disgrace. The courtroom murmured. Some faces showed satisfaction, others unease. Justice, when it arrives, rarely feels clean. In another chamber, Corporal Marrero faced his own reckoning. The footage replayed again, projected on a screen larger than life. The steam, the sudden violence, his squad crumbling one by one, his own body hitting the tiles, helpless under Ellsworth's precision. He stared at the screen as though trying to will a different outcome, but reality offered no escape. Conduct unbecoming, the investigator read. Harassment, assault, conspiracy. Marrero slumped in his chair, his bravado gone, his reputation in ashes. We thought she was nothing, he whispered, not to anyone in particular. We thought she didn't belong. The officer across from him did not respond. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. When the verdict came, dishonorable discharge, conviction, years behind bars, Marrero didn't argue. He simply lowered his head, the weight of his own arrogance crushing what remained. Across Fort Braxton, word spread faster than official announcements. Recruits who had once whispered in showers and corridors now spoke openly. The names of Webb and Marrero carried no power anymore. Instead, they carried warning. The base itself began to transform. Barracks once riddled with blind spots were fitted with new security. Showers once vulnerable to abuse were renovated with locks and monitored access. Reporting channels that had been traps now led to independent oversight. But the most profound change wasn't in walls or wires. It was in the air. Recruits walked differently. Women no longer hunched their shoulders to disappear. Minorities no longer kept their heads lowered in silence. Conversations carried less fear, more possibility. Yet not all embraced it. In corners of the mess hall, mutters still rose. The military's going soft. This isn't the way we trained. She's changing everything. But even those voices carried less weight now, because every soldier on base had seen the footage. They had seen 5 men fall in 30 seconds. They had seen truth caught on camera, irrefutable. And they had seen silence turn into evidence that shattered careers. No rumor could erase that. One morning, Colonel Hargrove assembled the base on the parade ground. His voice carried across the rows of recruits and seasoned soldiers alike. The United States military cannot afford to lose qualified personnel to harassment, discrimination, or toxic leadership, he said firmly. Our strength lies in unity, not conformity. This investigation has revealed failures that cost us soldiers we could not afford to lose. That will not happen again. Then he paused, gesturing toward Ellsworth. Captain Voring's operation exposed these failures. Because of her, Fort Braxton begins anew. Because of her, lives will no longer be broken in silence. Ellsworth stepped forward, her uniform crisp, her decorations gleaming. She didn't address the crowd. She didn't need to. Her presence itself was the statement. But afterward, recruits approached her cautiously. A young woman, barely 19, eyes wide with both fear and admiration, whispered, "Is it true? You took down 6 men by yourself." Ellsworth allowed the faintest smile. "The lesson isn't about fighting back," she said quietly. "It's about building a military where no one needs to." The recruit swallowed hard, her expression shifting from awe to something else. Hope. In Washington, congressional hearings began. General Blackwood sat under sharp lights, senators demanding answers. She spoke with unflinching precision. Operation Watchdog has revealed a pattern across multiple bases, not isolated incidents, not accidents, a systemic culture that punished excellence when it came in the form of women or minorities. We now have irrefutable evidence, and we will act. Her words rippled across headlines. Systemic harassment exposed. Pentagon promises reform. For Ellsworth, none of it felt like victory. Late at night, she sat at her desk, reviewing reports, her journal open. Names filled the pages, victims who had left, testimonies gathered, hours of surveillance. She traced the letters with her finger, her expression unreadable. Justice had come for Webb and Marrero, but justice, she knew, was never the end. It was only a beginning. The system was vast, the culture deep, and what Operation Watchdog had uncovered was not the disease itself, only a symptom. She thought of Kandahar again, the little girl clutching her hand, promises made in the dust. She thought of the recruits who had whispered their fears into silence. And she knew. Her mission was not finished. Not here, not yet, not anywhere. Because justice is not a moment. It is a burden, a weight carried day after day. A war fought not in deserts or jungles, but in silence, in paperwork, in hallways where no one is watching. And for Captain Ellsworth Voreen, silence was no longer acceptable. How far can one soldier's silence echo? 6 months after the tribunal, Fort Braxton looked like a different world. The same parade grounds where whispers once followed her now rang with cadence drills led by a diverse formation. New recruits marched with heads high, shoulders squared, their eyes steady instead of wary. Ellsworth watched them from the observation platform, her dress uniform crisp, medals glinting in spring sunlight. She spoke with the calm rhythm of someone who knew the weight of her words would linger. "You are entering a military that is evolving," she told them, her voice carrying across the field. "Our strength lies not in sameness, but in unity, in bringing perspectives and skills together to solve problems no single soldier could solve alone." From the crowd, young women listened with unblinking focus. Men, too, nodded, some with the slow realization that the culture they had inherited was no longer the culture they would lead. Ellsworth continued, her tone steady. "Some of you have heard rumors about what happened here. Yes, there was an incident. Yes, it exposed failures that went deeper than this base. And yes, those failures are being addressed. But the lesson isn't about punishment. It's about building a force where no one is forced to choose between silence and survival." She paused. The silence across the grounds was absolute. "A military where no one needs to fight for their dignity is stronger than any enemy we will ever face." Her words hung there, not dramatic, not loud, just steady, unshakable. After dismissal, recruits clustered in small groups, whispering hopeful. Several approached her cautiously. One young woman, barely out of high school, asked in a hushed tone, "Captain, is it true? You took down 6 trained soldiers in the showers." Ellsworth allowed herself the faintest smile. The lesson isn't about that moment. The lesson is about creating a world where moments like that don't happen. The recruit nodded, her shoulders loosening. For her, that was enough. But beyond the parade grounds, the ripple of Ellsworth's work reached farther than Braxton. In Washington, General Blackwood testified before Congress again, her words crisp and undeniable. "Thanks to Operation Watchdog, systemic harassment networks at 3 major bases have been dismantled. New oversight protocols are in place. Reporting lines now bypass local leadership. Every complaint will be logged at the Pentagon level." The senators leaned in, some skeptical, some supportive, all aware that eyes across the nation were watching. Blackwood continued, "This isn't about political correctness, it's about readiness. Every soldier forced out through harassment is a soldier we trained, invested in, and lost. That weakens us. Operation Watchdog proved what many suspected, that talent was being destroyed not by the enemy but by our own silence." Her words became headlines again. Congress demands reform. Pentagon launches oversight program. Across the military, bases received new directives. External inspectors arrived unannounced. Complaint systems were digitized, every entry archived in Washington. Senior officers who had ignored patterns were quietly retired, their replacements selected with scrutiny. The culture was shifting, not fast, not perfect, but shifting. For Ellsworth, The recognition was both surreal and distant. She received letters from service members she had never met. Some wrote simply, "Thank you. You made it easier for me to stay." Others wrote longer stories of harassment endured, careers cut short, dignity stripped. Some ended with bitterness, others with gratitude. She read each one, her face unreadable, her silence carrying their weight. But late at night, in the quiet of her quarters, she felt the toll. The journal on her desk grew thicker, its pages filled with names, times, patterns. She no longer wrote just about Braxton. She wrote about law enforcement agencies, intelligence units, even corporate contractors tied to the military. Patterns repeating, systems echoing. Her eyes burned some nights, but she didn't stop. Silence had cost too much already. General Blackwood noticed the fatigue. One evening she called Ellsworth into her office, the blinds drawn, the air heavy with unspoken truths. "You've carried this longer than most could bear," Blackwood said. "The FBI Academy at Quantico has requested you develop a program based on Operation Watchdog. They're seeing similar patterns in their ranks. They want your expertise." Ellsworth didn't flinch. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Blackwood studied her. "But every system you enter takes more from you. You don't show it, but it's there. The weight, the isolation." Ellsworth met her gaze, her eyes steady. "This was never about me, General. It was about the ones who left. The ones no one listened to. I carry them because the system didn't." For a moment, Blackwood's hardened expression softened. "And who carries you, Captain?" Ellsworth didn't answer. Silence filled the space, and in that silence Blackwood understood. Because some burdens are carried alone. Back at Braxton, the transformation continued. The showers were renovated, monitored with new safeguards. Administrative offices, once places where complaints disappeared, now reported directly to oversight panels. The base, once suffocated by whispers, now echoed with salutes offered without hesitation. But Ellsworth noticed more than just policy. She saw the way recruits no longer flinched when approached in corridors. She saw the way female soldiers trained without glances of doubt shadowing them. She saw the way laughter in the mess hall no longer carried the sharp edge of cruelty. These changes weren't loud, they weren't headline-worthy, but they were real. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, she walked past the renovated shower facility. The same corridor where she had once planted a hidden camera, where the door had once locked behind her. The walls were painted fresh, the locks new, the shadows lit. She paused, her hand brushing the cool tile. The memory rose unbidden, the steam, the footsteps, the arrogance. The moment she had revealed who she truly was. Her jaw tightened. She whispered almost to herself, "Never again." The words vanished into the empty corridor, but for her, they were a vow. Because sometimes change doesn't roar in speeches or declarations. Sometimes it takes root in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to break. And Ellsworth Vorey knew her mission was far from over. The military was only the beginning. What happens when the mission ends, but the work never does? The sky over Fort Braxton was clear, spring sunlight spilling across the parade ground. Where once there had been whispers, now there was order. Where once there had been silence laced with fear, now there was discipline lined with respect. Captain Ellsworth Vorey walked across the grounds with steady steps. She passed recruits drilling in cadence, their boots striking rhythm against the earth. Some saluted with sharp precision. Others stole glances, whispering stories about her that had already hardened into legend. She ignored both. Legends meant nothing to her, results did. 6 months had passed since the showers. 6 months since the tribunal. 6 months since silence had been shattered into evidence that shook not just a base, but the Pentagon itself. Now the transformation was visible. The showers renovated, the barracks redesigned with secure oversight, the complaint systems digital, direct, impossible to bury. The atmosphere itself felt different. The laughter in the mess hall no longer carried cruelty. The formations no longer held glances of disdain when women fell in line. But Ellsworth knew better than to believe in permanence. Systems change slowly, cultures resist, arrogance adapts. That was why she stayed vigilant. In Colonel Hargrove's former office, now occupied by a newly appointed commander, she met with General Blackwood one last time. The blinds were drawn. The desk was stacked with reports. Blackwood's silver hair caught the light like steel. "Your work here is finished," the general said, sliding a sealed folder across the desk. "The FBI Academy at Quantico has formally requested you. They want a training program built from Operation Watchdog's findings. Patterns are emerging in their ranks. They need your methods." Ellsworth accepted the folder without a word. She didn't look surprised. Blackwood studied her. "You understand what this means. You've already carried more than most, and you'll be carrying it into a whole new arena." Ellsworth's voice was calm, steady. "Systemic problems require systemic solutions." Blackwood gave a faint smile. "You never flinch, do you?" Ellsworth's eyes met hers. "I flinch, I just don't stop." For the first time in years, the general let out a quiet laugh, not of amusement but of admiration. "The president himself asked me to thank you. Your work will reshape the military for generations. That doesn't happen often, and it doesn't happen without sacrifice." Ellsworth didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence was the acknowledgement. As she left the office, she walked once more across the grounds. The recruits stood taller now, their eyes clearer. She noticed the subtle differences. A woman issuing orders without being questioned, a minority recruit leading a drill without hesitation from his peers. Small things, but important things. She paused near the showers. The corridor was bright now, its shadows gone. New locks glinted, cameras hummed softly. The memory rose unbidden, steam, footsteps, voices dripping with arrogance. The moment the door clicked shut, the moment she shifted her stance, the moment everything changed. She pressed her hand against the wall, whispering only two words: "Never again." Then she turned and walked away. That night she packed her belongings. The journal was thicker now, its pages filled with shorthand notes, times, patterns, and names. Not just Braxton, not just Beringer or McConnell, but other places, other agencies, other systems already showing the same cracks. Her boots were polished, her uniform folded with precision. She left nothing behind. At dawn, she stood at the edge of the parade ground, a black SUV idling nearby. The driver saluted. The orders were clear: Quantico, a new front. But before stepping inside, Ellsworth turned back. She watched the recruits drilling, their cadence rising in the morning air. She saw a young woman at the front of a formation, shouting orders with confidence, her voice carrying without apology. She saw her peers following without hesitation. For the first time in months, Ellsworth felt something unfamiliar, a flicker of relief. Not victory, not pride, just a moment of proof that the silence had been broken and others had found their voices. She stepped into the SUV, the door shutting with finality. As the vehicle rolled out of Fort Braxton, she stared out the window, her face calm, her eyes steady. Behind her, the base continued, transformed yet still imperfect, still vulnerable. Ahead of her, another mission, another system, another fight that would not announce itself until it was too late. She did not sigh, she did not smile. She simply sat in silence. Because she knew the truth now. Justice is not loud. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not end with one tribunal, one headline, one reform. Justice is fragile. Justice must be carried again and again by those willing to pay its weight. She was willing. And as the sun rose higher, her reflection in the SUV window merged with the passing landscape. A soldier, a captain, a woman whose silence had revealed more than words ever could. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.